Professor Mullett, Margaret, thank you for joining us today. And I was thinking back to a number of events that I attended that QGI made available to us in Queen's when you were director, and one in particular that stood out was a lunch for International Women's Day, when as an early career academic I was the guest of a QGI member and had the most amazing lunch in a lovely setting. But I met lots of women across Queen's who I would not have had opportunity to meet otherwise. And I think for myself and other early career academics, QGI brought us into a world that we didn't really know existed within Queen's, and that has had lasting impact, certainly on myself and my colleagues who went along in the early days of our careers to those lunches. And I do wonder, as you reflect back as the very first director of QGI, what were the main objectives that the group had then? Maybe it was about growing networks that I was a beneficiary of, but as first director, what were some of the top things on your agenda?
The very first thing on the agenda on my first day in the job was to find somewhere, an office for us to work. And that wasn't quite as easy as you might imagine. It was a bit of an uphill struggle. We found a space in the end which gave us space for me and the administrator and the coordinator, and allowed women to come in and talk to us in that space. And I think that's remained really important. The availability of the gender initiative to the Women of Queen's was always very high on our list. But the objectives of the gender initiative were simply to implement the findings of the Women's Forum report. And those were ambitious and many. There were 12, I seem to remember, in short term and middle term and long term. And they were very varied. They crossed the university. They were not just for academic women, and that was very important to us right through. But they did involve all the faculties. There was an obvious failing in provision of childcare for staff members. In fact, when we actually asked the women, top of the list was promotion. That was just career advancement that women cared about most. So there were things that were of general importance: childcare, flexible working, all these things which are now taken very much more for granted, and particularly in the last years, than they were before the millennium. But there were also specific provisions for specific groups of women. And the mentoring of academic women was a very important one, which connects, I think, with your memories, Karen, of the International Women's Day lunches. And we also had fairly regular professorial dinners for women professors to get together and share their experiences. We learned very quickly at those dinners what were the issues in different parts of the university. They were invaluable. We also were able to recruit women to our cause who might otherwise not have been terribly keen to engage in something so obviously feminist.
I think it's really interesting that what you had anticipated to be top of women's list, it was on the list, but actually there was a pressing need around information and support for those who were wishing to progress their careers through the promotions exercise that was running available for women. But my sense is that few were applying for it. And I guess that's where the mentoring program really was giving one-on-one support.
Absolutely. And tremendous support across the university. For all kinds of activities. People helped with people's research applications, for example. You worked from where the woman was and what she wanted out of the process, and came up with all kinds of collaborations which happened later on. You, I think, said events organised, co-organised between a mentor and a mentoree. Very exciting, really, what was achieved there, I think, very early on.
And I think a real strength of the QGI's approach to mentoring way back, and actually it continues today, and we launched the academic mentoring program yesterday for the forthcoming academic year, but the principles are the same. It's holistic, it's bespoke, it's what the mentee needs. It's not a one size fits most women package, and it's not just about the promotion next year. It could be about the research, the collaboration, the advancement for a career that will maybe go for progression in a couple of years' time, to allow for that planning piece and looking at the life cycle of one's career as one defines it.
Absolutely. Some women wanted to talk about specific things like work-life balance, how to manage a home and a career at the same time. Some people were really worried about that. Other people really wanted to look at more specific things about issues of when to put applications in and what particularly to do with them. So it was very exciting seeing that unfold.
Absolutely, and I guess when you were looking at the long list of the 12 objectives and the information you were hearing from the networks and the events and the listening exercises that we know that was integral to informing the objectives of QGI, when you project it to the future, did you have a sense of how long QGI would need to run? Did you have a sense for what amount of work would need to go in so that women could achieve their goals in Queen's?
I think it might have been a good idea that we didn't. But we did actually engage in a little bit of crystal ball gazing, in the sense that we already had very depressing statistics which had come through from the Equal Opportunities Unit. And given that there were so few women in senior positions in the university, we were able to project a little bit to look across. This is particularly for academic women, hoping to see them taking their places as pro-vice chancellors and deans in the future. So we looked for women professors, and we looked for directors of education and directors of research, which seemed to be an indicator of the kind of women who might be interested in future in stepping up to being head of school, maybe a dean or a PVC. And we were dealing, I suppose, with a fairly stable Queen's at that time. There was rather less movement, I think, at that time. So it was possible to make this kind of projection. It was very internal. We didn't share it a great deal because it was quite difficult to stand over some of the methods because it was quite small scale. But we did arrive at a conclusion that it would take until 2050, probably, to achieve
Quite
parity.
shocking.
So we were shocked. It didn't, of course, discourage us, far from it.
So thinking in the year 2000, that 2050, in as much as you could assess, given on a stable population within academia and Queen's and all of the caveats around the maths, but actually it wasn't so much a crystal ball, but it was a mapping out of it is going to take time. And what we're going to do is about a sustainable change.
Absolutely.
And not something that's a quick win, but actually was going to be very much a long journey. And that's where the mentoring and the building of networks and relationships was integral to it.
And indeed that we needed to work across the board, because a lot of people said, what are you going to start with? What's going to be the first thing you do? And I'd always say, we're going to do them all. We have to do them all, because it isn't going to work if we don't do them all.
And one of the real important areas for QGI has been to enhance the visibility of women. You talked about across the university, you talked about academic women and women in professional services, for example. What about changing the culture, changing the visibility of women? What were some of the early ideas on how that culture could be changed?
As we walked around Queen's, we saw very few women. Queen Victoria in the Great Hall, a very few other women on the walls, and I came back from a meeting in a women's college in Cambridge and realised that the walls were full of women. And this became something that we wanted to do. We wanted women to see on the walls people they might become. Not just portraits. In this room, we're very much aware of other kinds of visibility of women. But that was something that we found really important to do. And I'm really glad that it's become such an important part of Queen's and the Queen's collection, as well as the Queen's Gender Initiative.
It really is quite impactful what seeing women on the walls, and for example the Great Hall, can do. The real diversity of art and styles and colours that the portraits that many of us have seen. In fact, you were a sitter for one of those portraits yourself,
I was,
Margaret.
A very nice process, actually, very enjoyable.
I've heard of a little girl who was visiting the Great Hall with her mum. She was at an event and she looked round, as children do, and she said to her mum, "Mummy, what do you have to do to get onto a portrait in the wall? What do you have to do to be one of those women on the walls?" And I think you'd walked around Cambridge, you saw something different to what there was existing in Queen's, but sometimes we just can never tell how much impact what we see can have on us. And actually the work in the Great Hall has, I think, been reflected in some more recent work that women have initiated in Queen's. There's a wonderful art installation in the School of Law, not far from where we're sitting, and it's called "You Can't Be What You Can't See." And this features prominent women in the legal profession, and they've written a letter to their younger selves when they were law students in Queen's. It's a wonderful piece of art.
I would love
inspiring.
to see that.
And I'm not giving necessarily a plug for all of our art, but the storytelling through that has been very inspirational. And I guess that you've had an experience on the other side of the painting. What was it like to be the subject of one of these portraits yourself?
It was extremely enjoyable, in fact. Not a lot of sittings, a lot of conversation about what was important. My artist was very keen to combine various aspects of my life. He had done some quite interesting previous surrealist portraiture, so I was very hopeful that I might come out with a cooking pot on my head or something. There is a cooking pot actually in the portrait, because I do believe in feeding people as part of any social and academic activity.
Like the lunches.
Like the lunches, yeah. But we talked about my gender books, which had come back from Vienna, where I had a professorship in gender studies for a year. And we tried putting them on the Aga in the kitchen, and that was not terribly successful, and I think would not have been good for the books. So a big Le Creuset pot came upstairs to the book room and found its place in the portrait.
That's wonderful. And we've been thinking back over 21 years of QGI, and as first director, you'll know that many women and our colleagues, male colleagues in Queen's, owe a real debt of gratitude to the culture change and the things that you referenced that we're taking for granted: flexible working and provision of childcare on campus, and also provision to access childcare in the external settings as well. As you look back and think of where we've come from and what life is like now, is there a piece of advice you can share with us that you think, I wish I'd known that then?
I think we just have to be aware that quick wins may not last forever, that where gender equality is concerned, there's a lot of struggle to stay where you are, that very often in organisations, reorganisation, change can prove more crucial for women than for men. I think that we've probably seen that. The Gender Initiative survey of experience in lockdown, I think is a very interesting point here. That we just keep going, that we know what we need to do, and we just keep working to achieve it.
That's wonderful advice, Margaret. I almost feel that we've had a front row seat almost in watching what it was like and the processes that got QGI started, but also I think we now have an even richer insight into the motivations that were behind it. It was the right thing to do. It was about supporting people, and it really was about righting a wrong, both in terms of visibility of women and of their participation in all levels of the working structures within Queen's. And thank you so much for taking the time to share your reflections with us today. It's been wonderful having you back in Queen's.
It's been just great being back.
Thank you, Margaret.